simple. Let me just take that off. Oops, it collapses my screen. Can somebody take that off? Let me see. Oh. When you're screen sharing, you cannot easily take these notifications off. Oh, sorry about that. Give me a second. Hopefully you can see. So the pleasure principle is a very simple idea. We seek that which we experience as pleasurable, and we avoid the unpleasurable. It's not letting me pass the slides. Here. But a certain urge to repeat, which Freud terms a compulsion in many people, so it is very strong, it is a compulsion, makes him question what is beyond this pleasure principle. He writes, we might also bear in mind that the form of play and imitation practiced by adults, in which this contradistinction to that of children is directed at an audience, does not spare spectators the most painful of experiences, for instance, in the performance of tragedies, and yet may nonetheless be regarded by them as something supremely enjoyable. This encourages us in the conviction that even under the dominion of the pleasure principle, there are ways and means enough for turning what is essentially unpleasurable into something to be remembered and to be processed in the psyche. Later on, Freud will also ask, what is it that drives someone to repeat something time and time again? So the turning of something unpleasurable into pleasurable goes in the other direction and satisfies no pleasure at all. We've all been there. Continuing Freud's work, let me put that there, Lacan ascertained that what is beyond the pleasure principle is jouissance, a term clumsily translated as enjoyment, but which I prefer to leave in the French, for Lacanian jouissance has a trace of what happens when you have too much of a good thing. Too much of a good thing. It is not enjoyment. It is too much enjoyment. So much enjoyment that you want it to stop. Jouissance is excess. The eros of pleasure eventually leads to thanatos, the death drive, Freud's contribution as outlined in the text we are celebrating here, and an idea which many Freudians disavow. Oops. This jouissance and hysteria, I hope you're enjoying these book covers, by the way, I certainly am. They get from the sublime to the ridiculous. This jouissance and hysteria, the physical manifestation of psychological trauma with no physical cause, are inextricably linked. Jacques Lacan outlined his theory of the four discourses in Seminar 17, The Other Side of Psychoanalysis. They are quasi-equations where four elements are rotated into four positions. The positions are exemplified here. They are between an agent speaking from truth and an other who seeks something and produces something which is then lost. Now, don't worry if this is too much for a Saturday afternoon. You know, mathematical equations might be, but think of it as a game, which it kind of is. The elements of the discourses are a master signifier or a signifier outside the chain of signification, exemplified there by S1, the bar subject of speak, the cross S, objet petit a, and the signifying other, the place from which one speaks or knowledge, which is S2. So all this...
Laura, could I interrupt just for a second? Yeah. We've lost your presentation. If you could put it back up again.
Yes, of course.
Great. Sorry to interrupt.
Can you see it here? Let me see. Silly, Zoom is not playing today, is it? Let's see. Can you see it now?
Yes, excellent. Thanks. Sorry about that interruption. Great, thanks.
Sorry about that. Did you see the book covers? This is very important.
No, could you go back? We saw the first one. We just right.
So this is very important, from the sublime to the ridiculous. Look at these editions of Beyond the Pleasure Principle. I mean, I don't know where they got these ideas from. So I was talking about Lacan and the four discourses. So these are mathematical equations where four elements of Lacanian language speak with each other and dance with each other. We're going to concentrate on the discourse of hysteria. It is the hysterics discourse that for Lacan produces knowledge. If you see in the discourse of hysteria, that S2 is on where production is. In the product is S2. So it is the hysteric that produces knowledge, even if that knowledge is also lost, and not the university. The university produces split subjects, people who are torn. Or the master-slave relation, which produces objects of desire, or even the analyst symptom, the analyst discourse, which produces a symptom. Going to analysis produces a symptom. Anushka Grosse writes, the bar subject is the agent this time. She addresses the master, driven by the effects of her surplus jouissance, the truth that underpins her, thereby generating knowledge. The hysteric insists on telling the master about her excessive stuff, the fact that she doesn't quite fit into the limited discourse he has provided, thereby producing new forms of knowledge. The hysteric causes the master to think. In this sense, hysterics are very good subjects to have around because they stop people closing things down and answering questions too quickly. They keep discourse moving. And for this reason, Lacan equates the hysteric and the scientist, the person who isn't complacent about the phenomena they observe and experience. In the diagnostic manuals, hysteria marks women's bodies as pathologies, the wandering womb and the arching body, for example. This is an exaggeration of woman as disease, woman as response beyond the pleasure principle. Yet, if the diagnosis itself is marked by a denial of the visceral and a failure to know, to be a hysteric is to fail to know. I hope you can see this. If you're baffled, I'm doing this on purpose, and it's not only Zoom going wrong, this is Lacan. Madame Sarab writes that Lacan's writing are a rebus because his style mimics the subject matter. He not only explicates the unconscious, but strives to imitate it. Jane Gallop equates the experience of reading Lacan to that of undergoing analysis, complete with passion, pain, desire to know, transference. Susan David Bernstein takes it further and asks whether readers of Lacan suffer from hysteric symptoms. At the same time, his syntax, his euphonics and composition are also pleasurable. And here is an example from Shannon Bell, who tattooed on her body a post-hysterical discourse. She did it before me. I always wanted to do that. While hysteria and knowledge are linked, investigating hysteria is not for Lacan how knowledge is produced. There needs to be jouissance, a hysterization of jouissance. In other words, the structural introduction under artificial conditions of the hysterics discourse, that produces knowledge. Kira O'Reilly had a dream of having Shannon Bell's work replace that of Brouillet above Freud's couch in his house in London. This is how it is currently. But let me go back to Kira O'Reilly's dream. Hysteria as a Freudian clinical concept is very different from Lacan's hysteric discourse, which designates a specific social bond. One does not need to be a hysteric in the clinical sense to enter the hysterics discourse. In my performances, I am reclaiming hysteria as a way to rebel and resist. The hysteric fails to produce a kind of knowledge that is expected, and this is portrayed as feminine failure, misknown, misunderstood. The knowledge the hysteric produces is linked to the French savoir, an intersubjective knowledge related to jouissance and gain in relation to another instead of connaissance, imaginary knowledge, or even self-knowledge. Performing allows one to enter the hysterics discourse and unveil knowledge, bringing it to light, experiencing it. But the problem here is that the language per se does not release the hysteric. I want to finish with a quote by Anushka Grosse. If it will let me, yes. It is the discourse of the hysteric that pushes for recognition, requiring the counterpart discourse of the analyst to bring it to its full fruition, and likewise the university supports the master. So it's the hysteric's discourse that can open things up and produce change, which leads to the paradoxical idea that the aim of psychoanalysis could be to hystericize the patient. You're no longer trying to cure the hysterics and make them fit in. You're trying to shake up the lockdown obsessionals, the university knowledge types, in order that the master can be questioned. So to change, embrace jouissance, that which is beyond the pressure principle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was absolutely wonderful. I really enjoyed your paper.
Sorry for the technical issues.
That's absolutely fine. It's not a Zoom seminar unless we have one glitch. I think Zoom has inbuilt traumatic neuroses of its own. I'm going to move to questions now. The format for today is that we will take questions after each pair of speakers. And so I'd like to pose my question to Pippa after your wonderful paper about the uncanny in the city. I think one of the things that really struck me was that you likened your experience of Frankfurt, this new place that you found yourself living amid the pandemic, to an experience of the uncanny and perhaps the unseen presence, the spectral haunting of disease and death throughout the streets, is what you connected to the feeling of the uncanny. I wonder though if you feel like there is a way to speak about the haunting of the city out with the pandemic, by thinking about a spectral haunting by something like capital, the ways in which contemporary capitalism haunts the modern city. I wonder if you would maybe like to speak a little bit about that, as I know you've lived in multiple places and in particular interested in historical narratives in Germany.
That's right. It's a really good question, Hayley, because in fact, I actually wrote something just on those lines just last week, particularly about Frankfurt, which is, of course, a financial centre of Europe. And that is very evident when you move here. It's the only German city with skyscrapers, although they're not very tall. They are here. They're very much a presence in the city. We have the European Central Bank here, and it's a city of bankers. And it has been for hundreds of years, partly due to the presence of German Jewish families who founded some of the earliest banks here. And the city really builds on that sort of heritage. Conversely, it's also a city of challenges to that way of thinking too. The Frankfurt School was based here. I originally lived in a flat in the centre of the city near the Goethe University, and the Frankfurt School building was literally 5 minutes walk from our flat, along with a Marxist bookshop. You see Marxist graffiti everywhere in that part of the city, literally hammer and sickles spray painted onto the walls. And so I was sort of mulling over just last week, actually, the very sense in which money is a sort of spectral presence here. It's what kind of inflates the city. It's what lifts these skyscrapers up. It's a spectral presence, but it's also very much a sort of physical presence too. But there is a counterweight to that. There is a sort of it doesn't feel totally imbalanced because of these sort of oppositional elements to that. We were talking just before the official start of this seminar about walls of city and what is kept out and what is kept in, and that Frankfurt still has parts of its city walled within which the sort of rich people still live. Their neighborhoods are very elite. It's where the banks are. And just beyond the only sort of surviving section of the city wall is the remnants of the Jewish ghetto, the first Jewish ghetto to be constructed in Europe, and also the last one. It was still in active use into the 19th century. So, and that's also sort of uncanny too. Jewish families who helped found the city's wealth were also, until relatively recently, excluded from that, from actually fully participating in it. And it's Germany's great tragedy that the German Enlightenment was sort of partly founded by these Jewish people who became fully citizens, but only citizens for 75 years before they were then locked out. So yeah, I think you're right. It's very visible in the city, that clash between the two concepts. Sorry, that's not a very good answer. I kind of waffled all over the place, but I think it's like, when you talk about cities.
Very interesting question, and you know, we're okay with free association.
Okay, it's good.
I have another question in the chat, just one from Vipsa, who is going to unmute and ask.
I'm not sure she can unmute herself. Hayley, I'm not sure she can unmute herself. I think that's centrally controlled. You've muted yourself though.
I am going to find this person.
Why don't you just get her to write the question? You can pose it to Pippa.
Okay, I've asked to unmute, so you
but
should.
she can't unmute herself. She's not allowed to unmute herself.
I have unmuted her.
Oh, I see. Oh, I see.
Yeah, thank you, Hayley, for that.
Right.
Thanks, Pippa, for that wonderful talk. I'm sorry, my internet is a little inconsistent, and so I won't be able to turn my video on. In the beginning of your presentation, you talked about a possible connection between the uncanny and the pleasure principle. I was hoping if you could elaborate a little bit on that. I'm just curious to know, like, what are the connections really? Because I didn't think about it necessarily in terms of like the uncanny leading up to the formulation of the pleasure principle essay in Freud. So if you could like talk a little bit more about that.
For Laura, not for Laura.
That's a really good question. I think what I meant to say was it leads up to the Beyond the Pleasure Principle essay. It's this element of compulsion that you see in Freud's discussion of the uncanny, when he's trying to work out for his own sake and for the reader's sake just what is uncanny. He talks about the compulsion to do things over and over again, even though you know they're not going to end well. And he gives a fairly trivial example of getting lost in an obscure town in northern Italy, and it's quite telling in many ways. This example, he keeps getting lost. He's trying to get somewhere, and he keeps getting lost in the red light district, and he keeps wandering past all these windows with women sitting in these windows, and he can't understand what it is about his actions that keep bringing him back to this part of the town. So it's I think that's what he was trying to define as one aspect of the uncanny that you then see reflected again in a discussion in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the compulsion to do something, whether it's the fort star game that the child keeps playing over and over again, even though it may not lead to a sort of pleasurable conclusion. We feel compelled to do these things. And I think another way of talking about that, and Freud touches upon that in the uncanny essay, is that we think that we are in control, but perhaps we are being controlled by something else. We are not writing the story, whatever that story is, our own lives. We are being written by something else, and that is the uncanny feeling that I think perhaps is also reflected in the Beyond the Pleasure Principle essay, the sense that perhaps something else, the sort of the death instinct, is sort of compelling us to do something against our apparent will, and yet it appears it may be a useful or an interesting thing to do. So does that help at all? Is that good?
That's great. Thanks very much, Pippa. And of course, it's great to see that connection being made between the uncanny and the pleasure principle, because of course, as you should all know, I don't know if we said at the beginning, but just to remind you all that Pippa edited her book on the uncanny just last year. So Freud had written the uncanny, his work on the uncanny, only 1 year before he brought out the book on the pleasure principle. Thank you, Pippa. That's great. But I'm just going to go on. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask questions to both the two guests, as Hayley said. I'm going to ask a question now of Laura. And then after that, we'll go on and have our next two speakers and do a similar thing with them. Okay, so Laura, Professor Laura Gonzalez, I would like to ask you a question. It was a wonderful presentation. Thanks so much. It was so rich. And that really leads us to what I'm going to ask about, because the ghosting idea of the small g, capital H, that's wonderful. It really is. It's so Freudian. And it's really something about the notion of intersemiotic that you mentioned, to do with the discourse and how the discourse takes many different forms, or can take many different forms. You can invent new forms of it, as you seem to be doing. So inhabiting the very body of one of the patients of, or many of the patients of Freud, but one at a time, I think. You can tell us about that. And then, of course, there's also Strachey's translation, which inhabits Freud's original in German. So that's not the real final thing either. So, and then there's acting out. There's the acting out of the patient's words and feelings. There's also the choreography, as you mentioned, of it, the movement of the body. So there are many different aspects to this intersemiotic, as you mentioned, but yet none of them, it seems to me, none of them, but you can tell us about this, I hope, none of them can get to the bottom of it on their own. Is there a bottom of it? Or is it all about this intersemiotic relationship? To get to the question, you finished off with the quotation from, I forget the name, but you can remind us, speaking about the possibility of recognition of the discourse of the hysteric. And I'm thinking, how can it be possible for us, if you could speak to us a bit about this, what way would it be possible for us to recognize a discourse when we see continually that each discourse also means what it apparently doesn't mean either? And is that an uncanny sense, perhaps, Pippa? I don't know. So, for example, as we saw already, death means life. Lacan denies, for example, that Freud actually means death when he says death. Freud denies that you actually mean no. You actually mean no when you say no. He says that means yes, because the content is there. So the content of the no says that it's about yes. Joy and pleasure in jouissance actually means pain and unpleasure as well. So what I'm getting at here is it possible to recognize the discourse? What do we mean by the discourse then? What is the discourse of, what is the discourse? If you could tell us that, and how would we ever know what it means?
It's a very good question. I'm going to turn a little bit Eastern in here, which, when people know about my research and the fact that I research Eastern philosophy together with psychoanalysis, they're like, what? How can those two come together? But in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud begins by outlining what pleasure is. And he outlines pleasure and reality as the two principles of psychic functioning. And I think this idea of discourse, like much of Eastern discourse as well, is about balancing pairs of opposites. And is about this relation between an agent and an other, and how to establish this relationship. Lacan's discourse, all they are, is an exploration of what it means to speak. That's all it is, what it means to speak and what it means to listen. If you think of the master-slave, if you think the university with the teacher and the student, the analyst and the patient, the hysteric and the physician, is what it means to speak and how we relate to our own acts of speaking or when we are spoken to, and about balancing these pairs of opposites. So the discourse of the hysteric undoes itself. All of the techniques that I talked about in ghosting, but beyond with choreography, and I didn't mention, but there is also issues of ventriloquism in the work I do, and many techniques, vocal and physical techniques like that. They all come down to the idea of mimesis and to the idea of what it means to create oneself by adopting something or another and embedding it within one's body, how we can perhaps embody the other when we speak. This is why pleasure and death are linked in Freud's discourse, I think, like the idea of if you walk far enough in the line of pleasure, you find death. So it's a balance of pairs of opposites that are kind of part of a single continuum, and it kind of undoes itself, depends on where you walk the line there between pleasure and death. I don't know if that answers your question, but I would say that they're similar things.
It does absolutely answer the question. I want to go on further, of course, probing this further, but that's great. In this gloomy December afternoon, we've been so gloomy on here because we're saying that in this, I think you said the further you walk in pleasure, you find death. Wow. Sorry, everybody, but that's where we're at here this afternoon. That's great. What I'm thinking about, though, I wanted to think about this idea of intersemiotic, and if there's this relationship, interconnected, if you like, overlaid relationship of that one can get at with choreography, with movement, with translation, with acting, with analysis. I'm just wondering if we might get some purchase on that idea rather than thinking of intersemiotic, the Karen Barad idea of intra. Because, as you just said, the hysteric is bringing the other into their own body. So it becomes an intrasemiotic rather than an inter. So is it possible? And I'm wondering about this, is it possible because for Lacan, the other seems so central to all the expositions of his ideas. So is it possible to do away with the notion of the other and think about it as an intrasemiotic rather than an intersemiotic, with all these things together in one phenomenon, as in the Karen Barad way of looking at subjectivity?
Yes. I think that's a beautiful question, because intersemiotic translation is not my concept, nor Lacan's concept, nor Freud's concept. It's a concept of the field of intersemiotic translation, and I adopted it to be able to talk to people and for people to understand me. Sometimes when you're all Lacanian on them, they don't understand and they don't engage in conversation with you. But I'm going to go all Lacanian with you, Johnny, to answer that question. There is a concept of Lacan I adore, and it's called extimacy, intimacy outside. Lacan blurs very much the idea of in and out. Even the other is something we completely internalize, especially the big other. So there is a complete boundary of the inter becomes intra in a way, because that's the only way you can actually establish a relationship. When I'm trying to convert Freud's writing, which I admire very much because they're the polar opposite of Lacan's, they're pleasurable writings to read, as we have found out if you have reread Beyond the Pleasure Principle. So well written, it's amazing. It's like the idea of translating Freud's writings into something that will be offered by a body to another body. Of course, it becomes intra. The text is in me, and I start with words, and then somehow those words inhabit the body somehow, and it becomes intrasemiotic. But the translators don't like me talking like that, so I have to talk about intersemiotic translation for them to understand, because mainly is a field where poetry is translated to music, and perhaps painting into dance, and intersemiotic translation provides a common language for us to speak about what we do. But of course, it does become intra. We all internalize it somehow.
That's great.
And what's beautiful about doing these case histories is that the text inhabits my body completely.
That's really great. That's wonderful. Thanks very much, Laura. And it's interesting can kind of slow this down a bit. This is really great, really wonderful answer. Thanks very much, Laura. It really enlightens in so many ways. But it's also interesting because it leads on to the second half of our speakers today, because extimacy, the concept you spoke about, is something that I think, I wouldn't be wrong in saying, but I may stand corrected in a moment, I think that it's very central to Isabel's notions and Isabel's ideas and Isabel's discourse. It's something that is we find there all the time in her discourses. It's very interesting, and so that leads us very neatly, thank you very much, Laura, into the second half. And I think we're going to have Hayley is now going to introduce Isabel. So thanks very much, Laura. That's great.
Thank you so much, Laura. So as Johnny said, next up we have Dr. Isabel Miller. Isabel received her PhD in psychoanalysis and philosophy from Kingston University. Her thesis, The Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence, is forthcoming as a monograph with the Palgrave Lacan series. She's a rather prolific writer, having published in various places, including Still Point magazine and Vestigia Journal. And she is anything but complacent in her original and exciting explorations of the contemporary phenomenon that she observes and experiences, which she frequently and generously shares with the big and rather foreboding other of a popular audience via podcasts, television, and her blog, The Hysterics Discourse. So thank you for coming along today, Isabel. Over to you.
Thank you so much. That was such a lovely introduction. And thank you to Hayley and Johnny for this amazing event. And thank you to Pippa and Laura for those wonderful presentations. Can you hear me? Because I feel like this is frozen. Is that okay? Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so I usually often talk about artificial intelligence, and because I've just written a book about it, I'm actually not going to talk about it specifically today, but what I will talk about is certainly related to the way that I use psychoanalysis to go beyond the sort of normal remit of what it's generally often associated with. And I'm going to give you a paper today, and I have no visuals, I'm afraid, so I'll just be talking to you. So the title of this paper is Time and Taboo, Death Drive in Outer Space. Psychoanalytic theory is often wrongly accused of being a humanism and therefore not capable of addressing the new conceptual challenges that the post-human, post-apocalyptic, post-anthropocenic era may present us with. The mischaracterization of psychoanalysis as only reducing grand theoretical, political, and philosophical concerns to the singular suffering of the human subject has meant that often the radical conceptual possibilities of it are missed. The challenge then is to push psychoanalysis beyond its comfortable realms and outside of the usual concerns with either the clinical subject or cultural critique of media objects, and ask rather, how may psychoanalysis become a tool with which we ask new theoretical questions that, for example, different modes of thought, including artificial and non-human, our ventures outside of our earthly habitat, and the possibility of non-biological forms of reproduction presents us with. Given its shared ability to engage the unconscious and allow us to experience, as dreams so often do, forms of time and space altering logic, often the way to approach these questions is through cinema. More than just concerns with the gaze, desire and ideology, as is traditionally associated with Lacanian film theory, cinema can offer scope to think through psychoanalytic and philosophical questions in a way that empirical research simply cannot. Part of the aim of my work is to take psychoanalytic film theory outside of the confines of its traditional concerns with spectatorship and ideology, utilizing as a way of engaging conceptually with film as a philosophical text and a form of thinking. In this talk, I'll discuss 3 recent films that explore different aspects of this form of engagement. Denis Villeneuve's 2016 film Arrival tells the story of first contact with an alien race of kraken-like creatures, heptapods, who have come to Earth to, they tell us, offer a weapon. The weapon they offer comes via the medium of language, for which the heptapods operate according to a completely different logic than a spoken and written human language. The heptapods communicate via symbols, which they produce physically by spurting out black squid-like ink called semograms on a two-dimensional surface into the air with no linear sequence. Louise Banks is a linguist recruited by the military to try and decipher this language and work out what it is that the heptapods really want. In the process of learning their language, Louise experiences what appear to be flashbacks of the tragic death of her teenage daughter. In fact, the language that Louise is learning is not just enabling her to understand the heptapods and their desires better, but changing her whole experience of time and of desire itself. The heptapods don't think in linear time through cause and effect or past, present and future, but rather circular time, wherein all events happen simultaneously. Through learning this mode of thought, the heptapods give Louise, and by extension humanity, their help or weapon against the ravages of linear thinking. Her visions of her daughter's death then are not flashbacks, but rather flash forwards of the child she will have with her colleague, Ian Donnelly, the Los Alamos physicist. A feature often neglected by commentators on the film is the spatial and material nature of the heptapod's language. In the original book, Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, Louise discerns that the heptapod's speech and writing have no relation to each other. In fact, she discerns two languages, one spoken and one written, heptapod A, speech, and heptapod B, writing. Whilst the alphabet is pictorial, it is not symbolic in the way that human languages are. It does not attempt to represent speech. The shapes that they create with the substance that they emit from their bodies exist topologically as relations of space and do not relate to the audible communication that they make with Louise. Their language exists as real in space, but not in time, a true materialist position. In order to decipher the semograms, one must be able to perceive the structural coexistence of them all at once. Hence, the heptapods live out of time. One wonders then, given their apparent lapse in perfection, their allusion to a future time when they will need the help of humans, are the sounds the heptapods make a crack in the circular logic of their thought? The cry, which effectively humanizes them, makes them speaking bodies, and provokes them to engage with our temporal and finite universe. It must be that their perfect existence of plenitude and grace has been punctuated by the nightmare of temporality. In other words, do heptapods dream in depressingly linear fashion, the inverse of the human psyche? By the end of the film, even though she discovers that her future child will die, Louise decides to enter into a liaison with the child's prospective father, the knowledge of which he cannot forgive her for. According to her husband, in surrendering to the future she had foreseen, she made the wrong decision and rather should not have chosen to have the child and avoid the suffering that would befall them. However, as Zizek, among others, have pointed out, in a rival's universe, free will consists only in following through on a decision you already know you will make. Rather than attempting to avert the future as if it were the effect of some external will of God, by doing nothing, you are effectively creating, affirming, and enacting chronology. What Louise performs in her inability to avoid the catastrophe of her daughter's death is what Lacan, in the function and field of speech and language and psychoanalysis, would call the future anterior. Quote, what is realized in my history is neither the past definite as what was, since it is no more, nor even the perfect as what has been in what I am, but the future interior as what I will have been given what I am in the process of becoming, unquote. In a sense, what Arrival depicts is the atemporality of the death drive. Let's recall that in contrast to Freud, for Lacan, the death drive is not the ineluctable urge of the organic to return to the inorganic state, nor even the thirst for self-destruction, even if destruction and death of the organic body is a side effect, but rather the death drive is the insistence of a form of undeadness, an immortal life, a will to enjoy in exactly the way the fantasy demands, despite the catastrophe it may cause. The death drive, instead of pursuing an ultimate goal, merely circles incessantly around an intractable object. Whilst Arrival depicts the death drive via the paradoxical experience of freedom and determinism, that strange automatism which all speaking beings suffer at the mercy of their symptom, and the persistent existence of trauma as the only consistent reality shaping subjectivity, a number of recent science fiction films explore the function of death drive and our confrontation with it in an endless and timeless empty universe. As the famous adage goes for Arthur C. Clarke, there are two possibilities. Either we're alone in the universe or we're not, but both are equally terrifying. Pella Kaigerman and Hugo Lilja's 2019 film Aniara arguably proves the second option may be even more terrifying than the encounter with timeless heptapods. Aniara envisages the emptiness of space and the utter hopelessness that humans experience when faced with the deep time of the universe. The Aniara is a ship destined for Mars, on which the passengers expect that after a few months entertaining themselves, they'll eventually be rewarded with a new planetary existence. However, when the ship malfunctions and the passengers realize they'll be aboard for years rather than months, things go into meltdown. The panic-stricken passengers rely on the onboard virtual reality AI therapist, the Mima, to help them to deal with the prospect of this potentially never-ending journey through space, enabling them to virtually go wherever they find most soothing. The Mima fulfills the function of what Lacan would have no doubt termed a lathus, something not quite being and not quite the other, but which can siphon off bodily jouissance and attend to the compulsion to enjoy. Eventually, the overload of transference from the deluge of demanding and distressed passengers causes the AI to self-destruct in sheer despair. The trauma that Mima is having to process whilst presenting the passengers with the perfect solution to their suffering proves too much even for an AI. Once this last vestige of support is gone, the passengers turn to each other to create new rituals, bonds, and sexual attachments. Inevitably, with the comforts of consumerism and other distractions gone, a return to ancient practices begins as they attempt to find new meaning in the oblivion of their seemingly endless journey into space. They form a paganistic, erotic, religious cult as they try to come to terms with the frustrations of their bodies and the desolation of their hopes. Desire and its discontent and the deep time of the universe takes on a whole other nightmarish dimension. In the horrific climactic moment of the film, the protagonist is distracting herself with drugs and dance in one of the ship's nightclubs. When she returns to her quarters, she discovers her partner has killed herself and their baby. The guilt of having a child destined for an eternal existence aboard the Aniara with no planetary home in sight proves unbearable for a mother. Desire had been completely extinguished. All that remained was pointless death drive. In the unbearably sad last scenes of the films, we are treated to the seemingly infinite, inhuman view of the universe. In the unfathomable expanse of deep time, we see images of the inside of the desolate ship floating in space nearly 6 million years later. The scene from outside shows us, however, they are finally reaching their new planet in the Lyra constellation. The concern with time and its relation to drive in film has, according to Todd McGowan, even become a new mode of cinematic representation. As McGowan writes in Out of Time, Desire in Atemporal Cinema, the emergence of a new temporal aesthetic in cinema that coincides with the start of the digital age marks a change in the audience's relation to time and constitutes a new cinematic mode, that of atemporal cinema. The logic of enjoyment that this category of cinema exhibits, McGowan argues, switches from that of desire to that of drive. This form of film allows a spectator to experience their existence out of time. According to McGowan, atemporal cinema distorts chronological time to reveal the logic of repetition, a repetition that doesn't pretend to seek the new, but rather circulates around the kernel of an originary trauma or loss. In order for a film to be considered truly atemporal in its logic, it's not merely a question of content, but of form. The form of the film must not attempt a final restitution of fantasy, nor the obtainment of a lost object like the union of a romantic couple. Rather, it needs to present time in such a way as to draw to light the traumatic kernel around which the narrative revolves, showing us the logic of enjoyment that continually circulates around its object. In other words, atemporal cinema belongs to the death drive. Claire Denise's 2018 deep space psychological horror film High Life invokes atemporality as both content and form in an exemplary fashion. Reminiscent of Tarkovsky's Solaris in its focus on the psychological aspects to space travel over and above the fascination with technological innovation, High Life plays on the conceptual and perceptual disturbances in the experience of time that occur when humans are taken outside of the Earth. In terms of content, the manifest subject of the film is the journey into outer space, with the temporal and phenomenological distortions which this brings. The concept of the black hole, furthermore, and its very definition is the distortion and obliteration of time and space as we know it, but simultaneously, the form of the film is atemporal in the way in which it presents us, both the order of events and the manner in which the characters position themselves in relation to desire, drive, and fantasy. This combination of content and form in relation to temporality lends the film a particularly powerful mode of engagement with the scopic object. The opening sequence of High Life depicts a futuristic version of single dad parenting. Inside a spaceship, a small baby coos in front of a TV screen. An old black and white Western depicts a Native American dancing around a plume of smoke. while outside the ship, Dad speaks to her playfully via an intercom from the black expanse of space. Fumbling around to fix a window on the outside of the ship, Baby screams in his earpiece and he drops the wrench. Strangely though, instead of floating off weightlessly, the heavy metal object plummets into the endless depth beneath him. Things are not all they appear to be. Even so far from the Earth, the pull of human gravity seems to be exerting itself. Monty, alone with baby Willow on the desolate spaceship, warns the child not to drink your own piss or eat your own shit. That would be taboo. Well, at least it is for me, but not for you, he says. Not for you. Clearly, Monty is aware that for Willow, the symbolic laws that bound him on Earth are maybe not so self-evident out here in space. As will soon become clear, this film is concerned with one of the most psychoanalytic of all distinctions, the difference between the law and the symbolic. And at what point they cross over into a new dimension of ethics. Monty and his crewmates were all death row inmates who, having committed terrible crimes on Earth, have been selected for an experiment to go into a black hole to potentially retrieve its boundless energy and bring it back to Earth, the so-called Penrose process. The child is apparently the product of a reproductive experiment orchestrated by Dr. Dibbs, to whom they must supply their bodily fluids and offer their wombs in order for the next generation to persevere on the journey towards the black hole. All acquiesce to Dibbs except Monty, who refused to demean himself by forced masturbation. She teases him, however, that she'll get him one day. On board, actual sexual activity between the crewmates is forbidden, their sexual urges being taken care of by the mysterious fuckbox, a fully personalizable, turbo-powered version of Woody Allen's Orgasmatron in Sleeper. The only person we get to see inside the fuckbox, however, is Dibbs, on a metal phallus connected to what looks like a large, furry, headless beast whose giant paws occasionally reach round to caress her. Outside of the fuckbox, a trickle of white discharge streamed onto the floor. Who knows whether this is organic or synthetic? But of course, the ship's occupants have sexual desires which cannot be met by any sort of satiating machine, no matter how sophisticated. The film illustrates how even outside of the Earth's orbit, there remains an impossibility of reconciling sexuality with either nature, reproduction, or culture, social convention. The sexual frustrations that permeate the actions of the ship's crew are seen against the backdrop of the black hole, which they are headed towards. It acts both as an impossible object of desire, promising an ultimate form of total enjoyment for those that traverse it, and also as drive object around which their enjoyment endlessly circulates. It's a combination of atemporality in form as well as content that make the final impossible romantic union so paradoxical. High Life, in highlighting the question of genesis of a new population outside the Earth, attempts to demonstrate the impossible real kernel of the sexual non-rapport. In the final sequence of the film, the two protagonists both reach their final object of desire, allowing them their continued life together, but at the same time meet with the inherent impossibility of obtaining it. The black hole is at once figurative, excuse me. One night, the menacingly priapic Ettore decides to rape one of the women, Boise. He's stopped halfway through and beaten up by Monty, and then, as if to allude to the inverted Oedipal story that's unfolding, stabbed in the eye by Boise's cabin mate. After this scene of horror, Dr. Dibbs herself gets the idea too and decides to creep into Monty's bed one night to finally get what she wants. Whilst Ettore's rape is violent, unfeeling, and non-verbal, Dibbs's violation of Monty is gentle, discursive, and permeated with the pain of unrequited love. As she assails him in his sleep, Dibbs whispers her desires in his ear, asking why he won't give his reciprocation. The jouissance of speech and of the signifier is for Lacan an archetypal instantiation of feminine enjoyment, an enjoyment that, whilst it involves the body, goes beyond and in fact transcends the satisfaction of the organ. Lacan, drawing on Freud's formulations in Totem and Taboo, articulates what became his most fundamental contribution to the psychoanalytic theory of sexual difference in his logical formalizations, the graph of sexuation, of Freud's myth of the all-enjoying totemic father, which becomes the conceptual framework on which the notion of phallic and feminine jouissance is based. In Seminar 20, Lacan makes a distinction between phallic and other or feminine enjoyment, which corresponds to a different positioning in relation to castration, one which is to be found in the act of speech itself, yet paradoxically is unsayable, and therefore cannot be known. Dibbs' jouissance, even though it is obtained through the sexual act of rape, arguably pertains to another jouissance that is not phallic. Despite his lack of consent, Dibbs gets her real prize and manages to retrieve his sperm from inside her to take back to the lab. So we're shown consecutively two rapes, a female rape which ends horrifically and a male rape which ends with the extraction of semen. On the face of it, it's clear we should be disgusted and disturbed by both, but for different reasons, and Denise knows this is not a simple story. In fact, might it be that despite the extreme and brutal nature of the female rape, for some viewers, the rape of a man is still somehow more subversive. So accustomed as we are to visions of male sexual aggression, it becomes an almost unspoken part of natural law. Despite the attempts at physical violation by at least one man on the ship, the totemic figure in this context is arguably the symbolic mother, Dr. Dibbs, who is the only person who has any power over the genesis of the crew. The unpleasant and brutal version of the sexual non-rapport that we see evident in the contrasting male and female rape scenes alludes to the fundamental question of feminine and phallic jouissance, which permeates the whole film beyond the separation of the male and female characters. Dr. Dibbs occupies a figure of enjoyment that is both all-powerful and phallic and simultaneously pertaining to another jouissance, the ecstatic enjoyment of what Lacan would have aligned with the mystics in Seminar 20. Dibbs, as the controller of procreation and the totemic mother of the horde, plays with the position of femininity and genesis, provoking a time-old psychoanalytic question. In Seminar 4, Lacan, intrigued upon learning that a woman used a frozen stock of sperm from her deceased husband in order to inseminate herself, asks, "What is a father?" concluding that it's precisely the dead father, which is the symbolic father, a notion nonetheless already present in Freud. Much later in Seminar 17, in direct reference to totem and taboo, Lacan states, "Equivalence is therefore drawn in Freudian terms between the dead father and jouissance. It is he who keeps it in reserve, if I can put it like that." He continues, "Here the myth transcends itself through stating in the name of the real, for this is what Freud insists upon, that it actually happened, that it's real, that the dead father is what guards jouissance, is where the prohibition of jouissance started, where it stemmed from." Curiously then, it is Dibbs in the role of jouisseur, as it were, who confounds as to who should normally be orchestrating the insemination of multiple women. She's both the loving, protective mother and the ravaging father. As a figure of woman, her enjoyment is not limited to one form, whereas the phallic enjoyment of the male characters, the jouissance of the idiot, as Lacan would call it, centers always around the satiation or obtainment of a partial object. The film ultimately leads up to the resolution of a taboo, a new inscription of laws, a confrontation with the impasse of sexuality and the enigma of origins. It's through its atemporal structure, however, that the audience experiences the ancestral taboo at the heart of the film. The ship's Garden of Eden inner sanctum sets the stage for the encounter with taboo and genesis that the film is leading towards. Ultimately, Monty and Willow will be the last two living souls, and sooner or later they'll have to reproduce. The first time we're introduced to the older Willow, we're unaware who she is. Denise cuts to a close-up shot of Monty's hands locked into and caressing the hair of someone sleeping on his chest. The camera moves out and we see it's a teenage girl. He stirs from his sleep and pushes her off him. Monty sees there is blood on the sheets where she was lying. The ambiguity leaves the audience uncomfortable about what her bloodied underwear means. Willow says nothing and only remarks that she found all the crewmates' records and they're all bums and losers. "You killed your friend over a dog," she says. This reference to another classic instance of taboo serves to underscore the ambiguous status of Monty's actions in relation to the law. When Monty was a child, his friend killed his dog, which provoked him to kill her. The trope of killing a dog, an inherently innocent creature, signals a universal taboo. Monty's murder of his friend therefore touches upon the unspoken law that finds the killing of his friend redeemable because she broke this symbolic pact. Monty's childhood trauma will find its resolution when they mysteriously encounter an identical ship full of dead and dying dogs. Willow pleads with her dad to please bring her a puppy back. He refuses, telling her he can't bring the dirt back from the other ship. She complains it's cruel. "What do you know about cruelty?" he says. "You don't know anything about it." Next, we cut to Monty showering in the Edenic garden, as if cleansed from this encounter with his originary trauma, a subjective destitution, as Lacan would call it, perhaps. Willow calls out to him, "You were right, Dad, I have everything I need here." A sort of inversion of biblical Genesis, the temptation of outside knowledge is refused. The pair's unholy romantic union is finally made evident in the imagery of marital coupling in the last few scenes. On the verge of their final flight into the black hole as they climb into their white spacesuits for the journey into the unknown, Monty lifts Willow's space helmet like a wedding veil. In the very last scenes, Monty and Willow stand hovering in the black of space, smiling at each other at the event horizon. "Shall we?" he asks, as if questioning the morality of their next step. "Thou shalt," of course, being the Kantian form of ethical imperative. "Yes," she affirms, beaming up at him like a new bride. What is on the other side of the event horizon? Despite the deftness of Denise's treatment of the question of taboo and genesis, a conservative reading of the film could run the risk of focusing too heavily on Denise's treatment of incest, and therefore miss the wider significance of the way the film questions the very foundations of our social bond and confronts us with the unsolvable problem of desire and the undead horror of the death drive. Monty and Willow constitute the beginning of a new space colony, and as we know, colonies are always created out of unnatural and violent sexual couplings. What High Life dramatizes, therefore, and its uncomfortable allusion to taboo in outer space is the fact that reality itself is always already riven by sexual impossibility. And that's it.
That was wonderful. Thanks very much. That was really so wonderful, Isabel. You know, the thing about it is so comprehensive, a discussion of these films. The thing about the Lacanian take is that while, and the Freudian one too, but especially the Lacanian, while we seem to be always speaking about repetition, in the critique, the Lacanian critique, it seems we can go on forever without ever having a repetition, because there are so many different avenues of analytical avenues and critical avenues which we can go down, and that the language for discussion of these things seems totally unlimited. In fact, it's really unbelievable. It's wonderful. But what is interesting about moving on to the second half here is that while in the first half, perhaps the forms that our speakers, our two wonderful speakers, were using were perhaps more, I don't mean expected or traditional, but in writing and psychoanalysis were more something that we might expect or we might see more often with Lacan and Freud. Whereas in this second half now, with Isabel and with Lawrence, who I'm just going to introduce now, we're seeing something which is much more a kind of application of the ideas in different media. So, for example, Isabel just speaking about film there, and Isabel indeed speaking about the death drive in film in outer space. And so we're going to move from that now to speaking about the mirror stage, if you like, in architectural space. So still space, but architectural space as opposed to outer space. So then we start to, of course, question, what do we mean by space? This is what Lawrence Home is now going to speak about. Lawrence Home is an architect. He's an architectural theorist. In many ways, he's going to analyse the architectural space in a similar way, I think, to the way Isabel examined that outer space in terms of attainment of our objects. How do we attain our objects in these spaces? Lawrence Home has performed Lacanian analysis of spatial issues, and particularly architectural issues like perspective and so forth. His published book on Brunelleschi, Lacan and Le Corbusier deals with examining perspective through things like the mirror stage and so forth, and looking at paradigmatic forms of spatial consciousness. So it's something, it's an application that is maybe unexpected for a lot of us, and it's certainly very innovative. I should say, by the way, before I bring Lawrence to start speaking, that if any of you have any questions, Hayley and I will do the same again. We'll ask some individual questions of Isabel and Lawrence after Lawrence has finished speaking. But then, if we could open it up to everybody in the audience, and if any of you have any questions, if you could put them in the chat just now, and hopefully we can then put them to the panel of all our speakers after Isabel and Lawrence have finished. So for the moment, yes, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Lawrence Home, architectural theorist at Dundee University. Lawrence, could you take it away, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, and thanks for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me here. Because I can only do one thing at a time, I'm going to stop speaking while I try and put some images up here. and share the screen, because I do know what's going on here. Can we see that? Can you see that?
Yes.
You can. Okay, good. Right. Okay. Right. Okay. I was very interested, actually, Isabel, in what you were talking about. You seem to be raising the question of desire and drive in this kind of condition of infinite space and infinite time, or at least huge dimensions of space and time. And what I'm going to be dwelling in probably the opposite end of the spectrum and looking at really quite small spaces. I want to talk a little bit about repetition, and mostly with respect to London, okay? Actually the London Underground. Anyway, I'll begin. I'm going to read part of this and extemporize part of it, and so it'll probably be all of it, a little bit of a hybrid. In his paper, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud broached the possibility that we could talk sensibly about a beyond to the reality of subjective experience. We might expect, at least in a linguistic environment, that this would take him into the domain of nonsense. Vitruvius's commodity firmness and delight is pleasure principle stuff. So is perspective. If architecture and perspective define the spatial reality that constitutes the domain of the pleasure principle, it should be clear that we could not arrive at this beyond by following the vanishing point into another space, because that would simply be more reality. We would expect, rather, kind of along the lines of talking nonsense, we would expect rather that this beyond would be precisely the condition where subjective experience is destroyed by the very apparatus that supports it.
Lawrence, sorry, could I just interrupt for a second? We seem to have lost your sharing. I don't know if you're still intending to be sharing something. The screen has gone blank.
Well, I was intending to have something other than me on the screen the whole time. I don't know how to, what should I do?
How did you put it up before? Yeah, looks it's coming on now, I think. Yeah, that's us. That's great. Thanks. Cheers. Do
you see it as a full screen?
Yeah, that's fine. Oh, seems to have disappeared again. I don't know what happened.
I don't know.
There it is. That's it there. Just leave it there like that. That's great. Yeah.
I'm concerned that it might not be big enough later, but because I have some rather small diagrams. Can you see the word repetition?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, sorry. Okay. We expect rather that this beyond would be precisely the condition where subjective experience is destroyed by the very apparatus that supports it. Imagine, in the case of the visual reality that architecture makes, which we're looking at here, that subjective experience is shipwrecked upon the vanishing point itself. And so I just have a slightly tongue-in-cheek, Now how do I, all right, slightly tongue-in-cheek, kind of zooming in and kind of being shipwrecked on the vanishing point itself. Freud made 3 statements about the drives in chronological order: instincts and their vicissitudes, beyond the pleasure principle, and civilization and its discontents. The first paper puts the drive in relation to the individual subject and defines the drive as a stimulus response apparatus. The second, the focus of today, puts the drive in relation to the everyday reality of the subject. In this paper, Freud lays down the challenge of how to think this beyond, and along the way endeavors to find evidence for the presence of a death drive which appears as a form of repetition that unravels the life of the individual. The third and final paper puts the drive in relation to civilization. This paper, equally grim in its outlook, argues that the drive, which is harbored in the individual, will destroy the social bonds that tie individuals to each other. This one was written at a time when being a Jew in Vienna was no longer possible. Okay. Can you see these words?
Yeah, we see them, no problem, yep.
No, because it's very small on my screen. Okay.
We see it fine, I think, yeah.
Today, I would like to focus on repetition. To be precise, focus on the position of repetition. I want to position it in the experience of London, and also there's a need to position it in Freud's thought. We do not have time to untangle Freud's argument, but I've attempted to diagram it and Lacan's response to it. I'm probably not going to explain these. Freud first appears to define the pleasure principle as the domain of the life drive, as if the satisfaction of the life drive produces pleasure, and then to put in opposition to it the death drive and repetition, as if they maybe didn't produce pleasure. But he also argues that the pleasure principle is the domain of all drives, and that what constitutes all drives, what is beyond them in the sense of underlying them or supporting them, is repetition. The compulsion to repeat appears in Freud's argument as both the general condition of all drives and, as I've just said, the particular feature of the death drive, whose aim is to restore the organism to an earlier, simpler, and ultimately more inorganic state. In these terms, pleasure is then simply a detour to death. Peter Brooks used this trope in his book, Reading for the Plot, where he describes the plot of a novel as simply a really squidgy detour from the first to the last sentence. And to this day, whenever I read a book to my kids, we read the first and last sentences and then try to see how they make sense together before we begin to read the intervening pages. All we do for pleasure, whether it is singing Christmas carols, building buildings, or building civilizations, is simply a detour to death. Freud says that character, the character of a person, has the form of repetition, as does indeed the transference. In the transference, the patient reenacts with his or her analyst past relationships with others, and we have the characters that we're known by precisely because we repeat ourselves. We're sort of bundles of cliches. Repetition is beyond subjective experience, not because it defines an other subjective experience, but because it lies beneath all subjective experience. Repetition is beyond the pleasure principle, not because it defines an other drive, like a death drive, that stands in opposition to the life drive, but because it underlies all drives. Hence, Lacan insists in the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis that we cannot understand the role of repetition in Freud's thought without understanding it as an encounter with the real. The shiftiness in Freud's thought about the position of repetition with respect to the drives and the pleasure principle has been the focus of most of the critiques of the death drive by primarily other analysts and philosophers. The critique treats Freud's thought as if he were using beyond the pleasure principle to map a territory, in which case there are all these shifting inconsistencies, like where do you put repetition? And what they ignore is the unbroken continuity of his thought. When we attend to the narrative, Freud is quite clear from the beginning, from his first paper where he argues that the subject is a stimulus response apparatus, the drive is its flywheel, and it constitutes a form of frontier. From this very first paper, he's quite clear that repetition is what is beyond the pleasure principle. Anyway, that's repetition in Freud's thought. Now London. I have become interested lately in what a locality is. The idea of a location seems to me to be about repetition. In the UK, everyone has a local, right? Go down to the local. That's the pub that you call home away from home. Your local is not a local because it's near to your house, but because it's the one you always go to. What I like, oh, no, hang on. Yeah, what I like about the map of the London Underground is that it presents London to us as an assemblage of localities without ever scumbling the integrity of their identities as distinct localities by representing London as if it were a continuous surface. It is like the lure of a London that we could never not feel at home in. A comparison between the London Underground plan and one of those plans that draws the London Underground onto the actual map of London, a comparison between the London Underground plan and the plan of the London Underground, in which the lines of the Underground are drawn onto the London clay, as it were, should make that clear, this difference between these discontinuous localities and London as a continuous surface. Okay. This is putting a few localities into it. When you are in a London Underground station and you go to look at the wall map, more likely than not, the spot indicating the station you're in is scumbled out. It is rubbed out because countless people have stood before it and put their finger there. It's a bit like when you are waiting for the lift and you press the button twice. It doesn't bring the lift any quicker, but you do it anyway. It is like your finger knows where your desire is, even if you don't. Okay, your finger's always returning to the place of your desire. This double doing has a name. It's called idempotency. I'm sure I'm not going to say that correctly the second time, but we'll see. It is the idiom of Latin, like when you write idiom to repeat a reference. One of my colleagues, Donald Kunz, called my attention to it. In Seminar 9, Identification, Lacan argues that idempotency is the basis for identity. Identity is a repeat performance, a repetition of the signifier. Okay. I'm just going to. Identity is multiple and saturated with difference. It is, and it is marked by what Lacan calls eximacy. Okay. So wherever you go on the Underground, wherever you go, it is always the same plan. You are always at the center of it, and the center is always marked with a blank spot, the blank spot of the cumulative desire of countless subjects of London. You are here, and here is always blank. The station is worn through to the white, or even further to the jute substrate. Wherever you are, you are subject. You are a subject at that blank spot of your desire. In Seminar 7, the Ethics, Lacan says that that spot, insofar as it emerges spatially, represent or marks a lesion, a locus of pain. Okay. Lacan says in the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis that we cannot understand repetition in psychoanalysis except as an encounter with the real. The jute ground of the London Underground plan is no more real for the subject than the London clay surface of the Underground. It's just that this impotency of desire wearing away It's just that this is the impotency of desire wearing away the fantasy of locality that supports desire. Okay, now I want to wrap this up and almost here, not quite here. Those people who know me know that the endings can be almost as long as the beginnings. I want to end with a comment on what sort of a space this is, this idempotent space of identity wrapped up with the space of desire, the subject in London kind of wrapped up with each other. So, because this kind of London as a locality constituted by repetition, it's not actually constituted by two identities in relation to each other, a me or any other subject on the one hand, and then a London on the other. But I hope it's becoming evident that actually we're looking at one rather complex spatial identity, a psychical space of representation, of repetition, that makes London a city of localities to subjects whose identities are constituted by the localness of London, okay? And I'm reminded of like Lacan's claim that the signifier represents a subject to another signifier, okay? Freud called the subject an apparatus that thinks itself. We are the Vorstellung machines, representation machines in Freud's language, or signifier machines in Lacan's. I'm not saying those are identical, but there's kind of parallels between them. We produce signifiers in response to stimulus. That was the lesson of the instincts and their vicissitudes. I want to be here, or I am here and I want to go there. I put my finger on it, and that is itself a signifier, signifying my desire. It is a desire about places. That repeated point with the finger identifies the place as a locale to which I am associated. And I should just go to here. This is my last image. That repeated point with the finger identifies the place as a locale to which I am associated. It is part of the repetitions upon which my identity depends. There is a single surface that wraps identities of people and places. It wears away a hole that opens onto the absolute emptiness that lies beneath the world of the pleasure principle that only repetition can get to. My subjectivity is a surface. The London of locales is a surface. Lacan was so interested in the topology of Mobius strips and other non-orientable single-sided surfaces because they, in other words, my subjectivity and the locale London, the London of locals, form a single continuous surface of signification from me to objects, me to other, that wraps me to places, that wraps around itself and intersects, one side running into the other. Paradoxically, this is the spatial logic of the picture plane of perspective, that index of reality, when it is extended to infinity. In other words, when it is extended beyond the pleasure principle. That's the only place where I stray into the domain of Isabel, when the picture plane extends to infinity. I'm trying to describe that in the center. I don't know if you can see if there's a hand here, yeah. I'm trying to take a rather conventional perspective and extend the picture plane to infinity so that in the manner that it's shown in the picture plane in projective geometry. You can see the line A extends right out around in this kind of infinite sphere and doesn't return on the same side, but it returns here and in the logic of projective geometry. So actually, the picture surface is a Mobius strip, or an exact Klein bottle. Okay. Anyway, there may be a London, and so it's this kind of continuous but self-intersecting surface that I'm arguing is the space of a subject of London and a London when they connect at that finger point. So anyway, just one last sentence. There may be a London that is out there and an I am in here, in my head, peering out of my psychical locale. That's shown there, maybe. But the London that I'm attached to through repeated encounters that identifies me to London and London to me forms a continuous surface of signifiers that allows of no strong division between inside and outside, but only continuity, or not merely no strong division, but no division. So I'd like to end there. Thank you. Someone can say something. Okay.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lawrence. That's great. Could you unshare? Sorry, that was fantastic. Yes. I'm going to ask you some questions about that first, but I think we're going to go over to Hayley first. So I'll get back to you. But that was wonderful, and these two talks together, great. Hayley, you going to?
Yeah, I thought that was absolutely wonderful, Lawrence, and I have some questions for you myself. But first, I've got one for Isabel, which is probably quite a simple question, and it's in relation to. I mean, your paper talked a lot about the ways in which the temporal logic of these films are organised around particular objects. But my question is about the suitability of film as material for exploring time. I think it's Sergei Eisenstein in 1929 said that cinematography is nothing but montage. He's kind of speaking to film as the art form that best deals with issues of time and space at the same time. And I wonder if you could speak to, I suppose, the relevance of film, if we think about it as montage, something that explores memory and narrative process in terms of the clinical process. I appreciate you're not a filmmaker, but you are a psychoanalyst.
Well, I think, first of all, the film. Can you hear me? Yeah. Film allows us to see things that we can't see in normal humanly with our normal human organs. We can experience time and space through film in a completely different way, and also we can experience time and space in a sort of dreamlike way because it allows us to play with the logic of the unconscious, really, and the way that we can experience temporality in a completely illogical way through film is very much analogous to the way in which we experience our symptom or the way in which we experience our suffering. So in terms of its suitability to the sort of clinical process, I was, by the way, I'm not a clinician, so I don't call myself a psychoanalyst because psychoanalysts would slap me around the face if I dared call myself a psychoanalyst, and rightly so. But I would say that in terms of using psychoanalysis as a toolbox, a theoretical toolbox, is absolutely the perfect conceptual framework to apply to reading film, because psychoanalysis is a theory of the body, you know, and one of the things that film allows us to do is to play with different aspects of embodiment and time and the way that we experience the boredom or the excitement or all of the other affects of being human in a way that takes us out of our horrible daily rhythms. So if that was exactly what you were asking me, maybe I've gone off the precise question, but I think it was about the suitability for psychoanalysis and film. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think what primarily is my interest in film is to use it as a conceptual framework that allows us to explore different psychoanalytic concepts that maybe have been sidelined, sort of in favor of the more traditional ways of looking at psychoanalysis, as particularly concerned with the gaze and with spectatorship, but rather to think about the different other concepts that, particularly in Lacan, have been kind of sitting there and just lying fallow. So I think there's so much to do with that interface.
Thank you. I think that the way it kind of struck me was thinking about montage as a sort of string of scenes, and thinking about psychoanalysis as a process of revisiting scenes of memory. And the film that you talked about, which I like shamefully haven't actually watched, although I do believe it has Juliette Binoche in it. Is that right?
Yeah.
So I mean, yeah. I think the exploration of like memory, traumatic memory, really made me think about the process of psychoanalysis and the maybe the act of viewing the self through a film.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to add that, yeah, I mean, the particularly, I mean, the work of Todd McGowan is really interesting on this, but the possibility to revisit trauma, but sort of not explicitly, just through the visual and the scopic object, which is what Claire Denis does really cleverly, she doesn't tell you what she's doing, but lots of the time the camera's telling you something, you won't realize what it is, and then afterwards you'll be very unsettled by it, and you have to think, what were those images there for? What did they do? And often, because it doesn't have a sort of narrative form in the typical sense, that it does have this atemporality, because it's bringing you back to a certain collation of different ideas that, particularly in this film, is relating to taboos, relating to incest, and the way that she particularly focuses on different parts of the body, different parts of different bodily fluids, and the father and the daughter, and all of these weird images, which I think unsettle a lot of people for obvious reasons, but she's doing it for a sort of quite a clever denouement. But yeah, so I think it's definitely the subtlety of the way that you can do that in film is very powerful.
Can I ask you about an aspect of that, Isabel? You know, in Walter Benjamin's, the art in the age of mechanical reproduction, is it? Anyway, when he says that he compares film, obviously as the new art, then he's writing this in the 1930s, so it's a relatively new art. And we're just after the age of German expressionism and so forth. And he compares film and the discoveries that can be made for life through film to psychoanalysis. In particular, he says it's like psychoanalysis because he says it allows us, he says, space, aspects of space that were unconscious in our everyday life are made conscious through film. And he's talking about, slow, when you slow down, what's it called? Slow motion and jump cuts and all this sort of sudden changes you can make in space, and even the camera turning around, which shows us the extent and dimension and change in space. So he actually compared it to psychoanalysis. What do you make of that?
Yes, I think that it's particularly capable of opening up the unconscious in the sense that the psychoanalytic session does, because it's employing different parts of your sensory system to make you think things and make you make connections with things that you wouldn't normally do. And it's probably more than any other art form, it has this ability to play with fantasy and to enact fantasy. And of course, in a way that other art forms don't, because it's so completely all-consuming film, and that's what it's designed to do, is just, you know, you're there in the darkened theatre and you're completely absorbed into this world. And of course, what it allows you to do is unlock things that you may not want to think about, but they're there, and that's what film does. It brings it completely up to the surface. And whether that's just in the sort of mundane daily sense of fantasies about the different types of life you want to lead, or much more conceptual questions about time and space, which we might have been talking about with these sort of sci-fi films. But yeah, I think certainly film can do that. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, thanks very much. That was a wonderful talk. I'm going to turn the question again. In this, as I said, I felt we'd move towards more of an application of ideas, but maybe that isn't exactly what Lawrence was doing. I assumed he was going to speak about architecture, and it's always good to be surprised and shocked and proved wrong yet again in one's life, and that's how we learn, I guess. So Lawrence, the talk actually went places that I hadn't imagined, and which is absolutely wonderful. From the talk I'd seen you do before, which was specifically about architecture, this was well, about space. Was it about space even? I'm not even sure about that. But what I wanted to ask you about, Lawrence, was to do with this notion. Well, put it this way, when I was at school, right, that was an awful long time ago, I think you can all see. When I was at school, we were given some kind of cod science when I was in primary school. I was like about 9 or 10 years old, and we were told there was 3 kinds of beings, right? And that was the live, the never alive, and the dead. And that's the 3 kind of beings there are. And now I'm thinking about this death instinct, you know, this death drive, and I'm thinking, is it actually really dead that he means, death? Does he not mean never alive? Should it be the never alive instinct? Is that what we're returning to? So what in fact is the relationship between death and the object, or death and the inanimate? I don't think it's exactly clear. And you seem to be saying something along the lines of that repetition is the key to that relationship. Repetition is the transformation of the live thing into the object. And that the identity seems to be identity constituted by the localities in London, as you said. Repetition gets the subject to the subject is a void, and the repetition brings it to its inanimate self. Maybe I'm not sure if I'm getting it. I'm kind of throwing these ideas together. I think you were saying something along those lines. Could you clarify these things for us? I know that's a big question.
Well, the short answer is no. I can't.
Okay.
I think Freud's thought in Beyond the Pleasure Principle is a really good example of condensation. You know, it's like he's talking about so many things, and I guess the point I'm making about repetition, okay, is that it really goes right back to Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, that paper, because he presents the drive there as the kind of limit condition of subjectivity. I don't have the quote in front of me, but he says the drive sits on the frontier between the body and the mind, and it's where stimulus from the body, basically perceptions and whatever, heartburn, you know, anything, any kind of stimulus from the body, crosses over and becomes representations to the psyche. So the psyche is essentially a kind of machine for making images in, machine for making signifiers in, to kind of paraphrase Korb. And it's bound up in a kind of a stimulus response relationship with the body and the sort of material world. So it's absolutely, it's like what exists below subjectivity, marking the horizon of subjectivity, which is a limit or horizon that we can only ever see from the inside, obviously, you know, unless, you know, even an out-of-body experience is still somehow within, you know, our subjectivity. So I don't think, I mean, that's why, you know, Lacan can say in one of his kind of quips, all drives are death drives and whatnot. Freud doesn't actually say that. I'm not aware of it, but it's kind of the upshot of that incredible condensation of thought going on in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, you know, where, you know, he actually, although he starts out by saying that repetition is, you know, exists kind of beyond the domain of the pleasure principle. Actually, there's all sorts of cases of repetition that produce pleasure too. I mean, the way he discusses the Fort Da game, you know, he says, actually, you know, this child is mastering, producing pleasure or satisfaction by mastering a difficult situation. They're not, you know, reproducing unpleasure. They're sort of in the end producing pleasure. So, you know, the drive and the repetition that characterizes the drive seems to be the sort of baseline for subjectivity, whether it's pleasurable, unpleasurable, whether it's a life drive or a death drive or whatnot. And it is the kind of, I see it as the kind of mechanism, you know, it's the deaf, dumb, blind mechanism, sort of like symbolized in his thought by the body, which is the sort of substrate for the transparency of subjectivity. It's the sort of opaque, deaf, dumb, blind substrate for that sits underneath the transparency of subjectivity. That's probably super reductive, and it probably raises all sorts of questions about what sort of you know, universal subjects, and you know, and it may be so reductive that it doesn't really help explain anything. But I did think that but by moving horizontally to the example of London, I was hoping to try and put identity, desire, and this kind of deaf, dumb, blind, opaque substrate into some kind of relation. And by the way, I thought this was totally about architecture. I mean, it was about London, it was about cities, and even, you know, this insistence that actually it's a space, okay? This kind of me, London, identity, desire relay is a form of space, is you know, it's a totally architectural kind of obsession. And what's so interesting about it as a space is that it's not the perspectival space of the pleasure principle. It's, you know, I'm not really sure what it is, to be honest. I haven't finished thinking about any of this. I should just say these are very rough notes for, you know, maybe something which could be another project for me. But this kind of, you know, these paradoxical topological spaces that like the Mobius strip, simply don't orient, which is what the picture plane is when it's put into the infinite space of projective geometry, okay, are in some sense a form of beyond. They're absolutely beyond the pleasure principle space of kind of perspective, which is most people regard as the kind of index for reality. You know, it's in movies when people start hallucinating, it's the perspective that starts getting weird. You know, so anyway, I hope that I'm not even sure what your question was, but it was something about death, and you know, it's not exactly the body dying, okay, although that's certainly part of the metaphoric compression that in Freud's thought, but at least the way I'm spinning it, it's the kind of what's non-subjective in the non-subjective substrate of the subject, and that's not, you know, exactly alive, or if it's alive, it's pretty uninteresting or something. So.
Yeah, no, listen, that's a great answer, and especially, you know, so much to chew on there. Actually, Lawrence, thanks very much. And you know, with that thing about the, you know, the void on the underground map, in some way being that deaf, dumb, blind substrate, and yeah, I get that, and that's good. But I actually want to wind back to one, because there was so many ideas in your answer there, which is wonderful. You know, we're disseminating in many different directions here, which is wonderful. So I want to take you back to something you said way at the beginning, and I also want to open this up to everybody else, and maybe we can go on and see what other folks here, other speakers, think about this question I'm going to put now too. And I also want to say, before I put the question, that look, listen, everybody out there, get in this chat and put your questions in, and we'll start putting questions to the speakers. So get in the chat on here on Zoom and put your questions, and we'll put them. But anyway, back to you, Lawrence, and then hopefully on to the others. So Lacan is, so I'm just thinking that I'm wondering if the the view of the set of mental processes, for want of a better way of putting it, but the set of mental processes that Freud is speaking about, the view of that as a machine, if that's not a historical concept, I mean, even for Lacan, I think it was a historical concept. I can't remember which seminar, is it the second? Anyway, he's saying, Peggy, and there's someone coming in, he's saying in the second one, he's saying, look, actually, the reason why Freud is talking about energy and movements of energy and efficiency of energy is because he's writing this in the 1890s. We're at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. It's all about machines and power and so forth. And so this is the metaphor that's there, if you like. I don't know if we even call it a metaphor. This is the model that is there. And he's saying, but actually, by the time of pleasure principle, we seem to be entering into something different. And I'm just wondering, when I say, is it just a historical model, this idea of the machine? Because we're into another age now. We're no longer in the machine age. We're in a virtual age. We're all sitting here looking virtually at one another. We're in a digital age. So is it just merely a historical concept? I know we had Deleuze and Guattari still with the machine in the 1980s, but okay, is it just a historical conception? That's the question.
Right. Well, I mean, I didn't say machine. I said apparatus. Right. Apparatus. So,
I think you said machine earlier on too.
Okay, maybe I said both. Well, I don't know if it's just historical, but I'm not sure why that's important. You know, well, I think it's important if, you know, sometimes the metaphors we use get in they channel our thought, and they get in the way of thinking about things in other ways. And so sometimes, you know, a big discovery in the humanities happens because the metaphors change, and suddenly, you know, we're able to think about the same things in different ways. I mean, that's quite different from the way discoveries happen in the sciences, for instance. So I don't think it's trivial that, you know, I'm sure that the metaphor of the machine or the apparatus is channeling this thought a certain way, but I mean, as you said, you know, it's still alive and well in the work of Deleuze and Guattari, and Agamben, and you know, this idea that, you know, it may not be a material, it may not be a machine that processes materials, but we erect, you know, vast symbolic scaffolds in order to position ourselves in the world. And that's kind of what an apparatus is. So,
great.
I mean,
I wonder, Laura's got her hand up. If we could shift to Laura, do you mind, Lawrence? And
no, please.
I know you're a gentleman, Lawrence.
I just wanted to say that I don't feel my answer was very adequate, but I wasn't quite sure what you were getting at. I just, and maybe Laura will pitch in. And
no, I think it was an adequate discussion of the, absolutely. No, absolutely. Yeah. Laura, you were going to speak?
If you don't mind, I want to come into the issue of the metaphor in there with Freud.
Yeah.
That's not the only metaphor Freud had throughout his text. I think he was a bit of a master of metaphor. He explained the workings of the mind as a machine, but he also explained the workings of the mind as space, the topographical metaphors, and he explains the conscious, pre-conscious, unconscious with you enter a room, which is an anti-room, and then you have to enter another room. And he also had the archaeological metaphor as well. So I think what Freud was doing there is trying to help us conceptualize how unknown parts of ourselves work with perhaps things that are a little bit more tangible for us. But by no means, and you know, he played a lot. He was such a good, like Lawrence, you said about the mind is there to make images. He was so good at creating images in text. And the machine is a very vivid image at the time and the historical time, but there were others as well in there. And I think
that was good.
Them all together. Yes, Lawrence.
No, the anteroom, the archaeological stuff, that's all brilliant. Yeah, thanks for reminding us.
It seems to me that Lawrence's paper, or Lawrence, your paper, speaking as if you're not here, I mean, Johnny, your question about is it historical or is it still relevant? Like the model that Lawrence elaborates on or presents to us, I think what it does is it explains how, or explains that the mechanics of intersubjectivity across, you described it as a single surface, and you talked about it in terms of a city, so an urban built environment. But really, you're talking about commons, aren't you? And that's perfectly applicable as a model to a sort of dematerialized or post-material commons, whether that's virtual or digital or whatever. And, you know, as Laura said, Freud uses these spatial metaphors to describe the unconscious, which is dematerial. And in thinking about a city, it's micro up to macro, isn't it, about the, I suppose, processes that are applicable across human society and interactions between signifying machines.
Yeah. Sorry. These are great points, Haley. But I wasn't criticising. I have to say this. I wasn't criticising Lawrence. I was actually asking about Freud. But yeah, those are great points. What about Pippa and Isabel? Have you any comments on? Yeah. Any comments on that question?
So I was struck by something you were saying earlier about, can you hear me? Is that right?
Yeah, I was pointing to Isabel.
I was struck by the discussion about repetition that you were having earlier and the requirements for repetition as sort of helping to define us in our environment. And I was thinking that repetition is actually a requirement for successful science. When you carry out an experiment, it only counts as an experiment that can be included within the scientific canon if it can be repeated under different circumstances. So I don't really have, that kind of just occurred to me when you were talking about that repetition is all important in physical and natural sciences. And I'm not sure how you can account for that in sort of psychoanalysis. I know that social scientists perhaps feel the sort of slight anxiety about that and the slight anxiety about what you mean by repetition, but it's a kind of gold standard. And I was also struck by what you were saying about film too, when you and Isabel were talking about the emergence of film in the early sort of 20th century. And again, modern science around about that time is completely reliant on film to record things that it would not otherwise be able to see, like it can't record electrons, but it can record the passage of electrons through space-time, and we see that first of all in the 1920s, for example. So film is not just a sort of medium for exploring our sort of fantasies at that time. You sort of see that, of course, in sort of like German expressionism and all the rest of it. At that sort of same time and space, it was also being used to record reality for the first time, a reality that we would not otherwise be aware of. And that was very anxiety making. You see the sort of great debates between Mach and Boltzmann just slightly earlier about what actually constitutes reality if you can't actually see it with your own eyes. Are you capable of talking about it within science? Does it count as science? Is an atom actually part of science? So that's what I was sort of struck by when you were sort of having that conversation. Sorry, it takes us off slightly different places.
No, no, absolutely. The science thing, we've just had a question in the chat, which is scientific based, so I'm going to come back to you on that, Pippa, but I'm just wondering, I don't know if Isabel was going to come in on that question first of all before we do the science thing.
No, carry on. I was engrossed.
All right, we're all engrossed. There's no doubt about that. Yeah, we've got a question in the chat from, who was it from, Peggy? From Ash Singh. And the question is, so I think we're all listening, but Pippa might be somebody very specialist for this. Can you elaborate on beyond the pleasure principle in relation to energy dynamics and the Helmholtzian principle of thermodynamics?
Yes, I was stuck a little bit in the chat room about it because, again, I was thinking about that. And that's really sort of taking us back to the interaction between life and death, the sort of differences, or what actually constitutes the difference between a living organism and an not living organism. I need to be a bit careful about sort of with respect to what you were saying earlier about the difference between a dead organism and an inanimate organism. So, but to say something about what life is in terms of thermodynamics is very interesting, and I think it's sort of very relevant. So, talking about thermodynamics, we can discuss this this concept of entropy, which is synonymous with disorder, and the sort of absolutely fantastic success of 19th century physics from Helmholtz in the sort of mid-late 19th century and Boltzmann was to quantify how the energy in a system could be defined, and to quantify this substance called an entropy, the disorder of a system that takes away the usable energy of a system. So broadly speaking, everything decays into an increasingly high state of entropy. And that really is the definition of time. And that was Boltzmann's brilliant contribution to 19th century physics. Almost like the only definition of time that we have in physics is that it's actually intimately linked to the increase of entropy. You can measure the forward passage of time from before to after by measuring the amount of entropy. And time is a very problematic concept in physics. That's the only way we can actually measure the sort of before and after. The arrow of time is through entropy. And then Schrödinger came up with the idea of life as actually being a state of negative entropy. The only reason that we can live is that our entropy is constantly kept low. We are not decaying as organisms, as people, as living things. And the only reason that we can do that by keeping our entropy low is by creating a sort of disorder around us, by sort of creating this artificial sort of gradient in entropy from us at a low state and from a sort of disorder around us in a high state. And you can see the way that we do this in sort of society by simply extracting energy and leaving behind sort of unusable states of energy. So by sort of burning coal to make ash, for example, that's a sort of state of it. So I'm thinking that this idea of the death drive in terms of us wanting, sort of needing to get back to from an alive state to a dead state is simply some kind of sort of psychological sort of manifestation of this sort of inevitability of the second law of thermodynamics, that entropy always increases, and is simply another way of embodying that. I don't know whether that's true, whether Freud was really thinking about that, but it kind of fits in. You could, I think, the physical sort of discussion of entropy in the second law of thermodynamics could be possibly equivalent to the death drive. That's a bit of a sweeping statement.
Yeah. No, I think that's massively interesting, especially in the Lacanian point of view, I think, because of that endlessness of the discourse. And as Laura said earlier on, so it's a real pleasure, dodgy word to use, but real pleasure to read the Freud, but to read the Lacan, it's just endless, and it just keeps going on and more and more. And the discourses are wonderful, but there's never going to be an end to it. It's this entropy, if you like. And so I'm thinking about you, Laura, with the choreography, with the acting, with the entering the body, with the translation. So there's all these different forms spinning out of almost out of control. What do you make of that, Laura, in terms of the entropy as a principle there of the Lacanian, I wouldn't call it direction, but operation?
I think that's a very, very good question. So Freud wrote the way he wrote because he began his clinical life alongside hysterics, which are a form of neurotic. And Lacan wrote the way he wrote because his doctoral work was the case of Amy, who's a psychotic. So Lacan wrote like a psychotic. There is sometimes no head nor tails. And I think the actual, and this is what I said, don't get hung up with the discourses, think of them as games, because they are playful. This is the beauty of it. When you let go of the idea of extractionism, trying to extract meaning from it, and you just let them just come to you a little bit more passively, they are incredibly beautiful and melodic. But the discourses, all the discourses of Lacan are really the easy part to read. When you go to Écrit, you just want to bang your head against the wall. And Écrit is one of the few texts he actually wrote as text. The seminars are spoken. It's him speaking, like in the beautiful film you shared in the Drouth, which was if you haven't seen it, watch it, because Lacan is mesmerizing speaking. It's just absolutely incredible. You could just play him around all day and just enter some state in the mind. I don't know what he would be like an analyst. And I want also to mention about Lacan's writing that he suffered a great tragedy during his life. Lacan had an amazing life. If you can ever read a biography, it's just definitely worth reading. I will tell you as a preamble that he owned Courbet's The Origin of the World. He was one of the owners of that painting. He had it in his house, and I just think that tells you everything you need to know about Lacan. But the great tragedy he suffered in his life is being such a wonderful orator and an incredibly difficult writer. He lost his voice. He was unable to speak towards the end of his life. And I think that's really incredibly interesting, because there is this drive and repetition in his speech and in his text that, sometimes I think of the death drive towards when he lost his voice towards the end of his life.
Yeah. Well, spoken as a true performer, Laura. You know, don't try and extract meaning, just go with it. Wonderful. Isabel, do you need to defend Lacan? You know, she's saying he's difficult, he's impossible. Don't try to understand him. Just go with him. You know, in tragedy, I don't know. What do you make?
Do I need to defend him? Oh, I think he can defend himself. But I think, well, yeah, of course, the seminars are spoken and should be read in a different way from the écrits, because the écrits were his writing ups of his thinking along the way over the years of his seminars. But I think that it was what was brilliant, as Lara was explaining, you know, how mesmerizing he is, and he must have been to be in the room with, because what was so sort of intriguing and original about his teaching was that he was forming psychoanalysts, and what he was trying to do in his seminars was to teach people what psychoanalysis is, and it's a relation of transference, and it's the material of it is speech. There's nothing else than speech. And, you know, to be able to engage with the way that Lacan was using speech, he was trying to alert people to all of the multiple dimensions and complexities that are going on with the fact that we are speaking beings, and the fact that to do anything in the world we have to create a shared symbolic realm of meaning, but that also implicates the body, and that implicates the fact that we writing is not the same as speech, you know, and he was very aware of the fact that writing is not the same as speech, and that the fact that when we're speaking, we're also doing a form of writing, and we're writing a symptom for ourselves. So there were so many things going on in his seminars that the reason they're so frustrating maybe to read, because they're not supposed to be understandable immediately, and that's also their beauty and their charm, and of course that also gets a lot of people knickers in a twist. Lots of sort of analytic philosophers, British analytic philosophers, of course, as we all know, have extreme problems with Lacan and think that he's an unnecessary showman, and it's all obfuscation and florid language for the sake of it. But it really isn't. I mean, you can find him an absolute arse, that's absolutely fine, but it doesn't take away from the particular value of what he was doing as distinct from anybody else in his time, and also the conflagration of him as just this, oh, he was a post-structuralist, and they're all the same, you know, Derrida and Lacan and Lyotard, which is, again, to just elide this whole group of people because they're talking about language and the complexity of language as if they were doing the same thing. And he was particularly different from all of those of his who he's often lumped together with, because of the fact that he was a psychoanalyst. He wasn't a philosopher, and he didn't say that he was a philosopher, and his relationship to philosophy is of course extremely complex, but it formed part of his teaching and part of his method. But yeah, I think that he doesn't need defending, and I don't defend him, but but I do defend him because I think that he's often misunderstood.
Yeah, so that's really great. So I love that image of him as an arse with his knickers in a twist. That's great. That's going to stay with me. That is Lacan. Okay, but and of course I can think of no more. I'm going to say this word now. I can think of no more performative image than Lacan as an arse with his knickers in a twist. And you know, so there we are. I'm throwing that word out. You know, it's massively overused. It's been the big fashionable word for a while, but performative, is that what we're saying about his talks, his speeches, his seminars, as opposed to his writing? It's performative.
Yeah, I mean, yes, definitely it's performative, because he was aware of the fact that he was there was a transference going on in the room with people, and that him speaking had an effect, and he was completely aware of that effect. But he also wanted people to be aware of the fact that he was forming psychoanalysts, and they need to be aware that is going to be for them too the same. If you know this, what they're trying to do as a psychoanalyst is play with somebody's transference, and in fact which for Lacan is love. It's the same thing basically. So it's a game, yes, but it's a very serious game that we all play. Whether you're a psychoanalyst or not, we're all doing that all the time. Every time we have a conversation with anyone.
That's great. Thanks, Isabel. Thanks so much.
Let's just come in on that, Johnny, if you don't mind, just very quickly. Yeah. I want to say about Lacan and the performative. Of course he was performative, but performance forces you to pay attention. And this is precisely what he did in his innovation of clinical practice. Lacan created the variable hour. You might come into his clinic and he might dispatch you within 5 minutes or keep you there for 5 hours. You never knew how long you were with him. And that forces you to pay attention. Like in my one-to-one performances, you never know how long you're going to be with me. Could be 5 hours, and I learned that from him, this idea of the performative as a way of really, truly paying attention to what's happening.
Yeah, you don't, sorry, you're going to say, Hayley?
I was just going to say, well, to thank Laura for that point, and note that we have another question in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Should we go on to some of the other questions?
Yeah, why not? Yeah.
And then we have,
we can hear a question, but I want to say something too.
Okay, so we'll go question, then Lawrence, and then we have a kind of broader question, I think, to carry forth the discussion if unless we have some more from the audience. I mean, you've all turned your screens off, but I hope you feel the pressure of me expecting questions from you. So I've got Alistair, who's asked, can you elaborate on Freud's use of myth, Plato in the Symposium, and the reference of the
Upanishads
as a footnote, as a means of seeking to employ myth alongside science? So we know that Freud's was revisiting of classical myth, Greek tragedies.
Why don't we start with Lawrence? He's been quiet for a wee minute.
I'm not sure what the questioner was referring to in particular, but the question about the Upanishads, is that in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, or I just wonder. But I mean, he used myth. I guess the way Isabel is using film as a human artifact that is subject, like all human artifacts, to critique and critical discussion. And in this case, particularly from the kind of conceptual frame that psychoanalysis offers us. I mean, in that sense, I see, him treating myth as first object of analysis in the way that a book or a film might be the object of analysis, and then secondly, using myths, probably selectively. I bet he doesn't use all myths, but some of them, because he realizes that they're templates or models for behavior. So things like the Oedipus myth, or Lacan uses, what is it, Apollo and Daphne, and so forth. That has never been elevated to a psychoanalytic structure the way the Oedipus myth has, but that's how I see him using them.
I think the Upanishads, from what I understand, is from the Hindu Vedas, and so I wondered if Laura would be the person who could maybe explore that specific question. Not to put you in the spot, Laura.
No, I was trying to find, I know my Upanishads well, I was trying to find where in Freud it's in the footnotes. We're very lucky that Freud was a very learned man, not only a scientist man, but he had a very broad view of humanity. And, if you go to his house in London and in Vienna, you can see he was a rich collector of antiquities. And he really was surrounded by very beautiful things and art. The Upanishads are the fourth book in the Vedas. Vedas mean revelations. They're things the old rishis in India, old seers in India, basically they're aha, eureka moments, Archimedes moments, you know, like, oh yes, this is truth. And in particular, the Upanishads, I think the translation of the word Upanishad is sitting near. That's what it means, which is very relevant to psychoanalysis, because that's what we do when we go to the clinic. We sit near the analyst. And in India, the majority of ancient teachings are told through myth. This is why there are hundreds of thousands of gods, because the unutterable, the difficult, what cannot be made manifest is told through language, through myth, to make manifest. And I wonder if Freud, for us to understand and be able to relate to the Oedipus complex, he needed to call upon Oedipus himself in a way. In India as well, there is another way of relating to myth, and it's called Puranas. Purana means, I think, literally as it was then, it is now. So there is a time element to this idea of the myth. It's like Isabel was talking about, you know, the idea of film as well. One of the great Upanishads, I think, well, and my philosophy, my Eastern philosophy teacher thinks so too, is Star Wars, you know, in a galaxy far, far away, but it is true now. You can still see things perhaps you have experienced related in these films, and it's the same with the Puranas. These are stories that are absolutely eternal, and I think Freud tapped into that very much to actually tell us who we are, because Freud was also a generalist. He had his case histories, and he was a very good writer of case histories, but he's talking about humanity here, really.
I think that's so interesting. The Vedas are not something that I know a great deal about, but the translation of them as revelation, it makes me think of Heidegger's aletheia, which means to, in Greek, I think the literal translation is that which cannot be unseen. And this image of the blinding around the myth of Oedipus, this the myth is allowing us to understand something in a kind of irrevocable sort of way. That the primal scene is something that marks us eternally, a knowledge that can't be discarded. There's no return to a pre-lapsarian kind of pre-mythical state. Okay, so the question that we wanted to put to everyone, all four speakers, this is a symposium which celebrates the centenary of Freud, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and by revisiting that text, we're also asking how is Beyond the Pleasure Principle relevant today? What possibilities or provocations does it still offer for readers in 2020? I wonder if we want to start with Lawrence, who I know had a point that he wanted to come in with as well.
Okay, well, yeah, the question I had was, I was really struck by how different all of our presentations were. Okay, I wanted to talk about those for a minute. I think, for instance, we were talking about, you know, Lacan's rather pronounced performative approach to his lectures. Actually, everybody, there's a performative element in everyone's work. I mean, a corpse lying on a table is performing too. It's just rather understated, okay? You know, it's just not quite as flamboyant as maybe Lacan's performance. But everything that we saw today was some version of a performance. And they were very different. And probably more important than that, it seems like we're all using Lacan in very different ways, okay? And I just thought, you know, I'm not quite sure I could just sort of say, you know, all of what those different ways were, but I mean, just in the most superficial way, obviously Laura is using Lacan as a kind of provocation for performance art, which probably then gets either filmed or written up in different, documented in different ways. Isabel, all I know of your work is what I've seen today, but obviously you're using Lacan as kind of, you know, film critique as a way of extracting from it key ideas about, you know, subjectivity in contemporary life. And I don't really know how I can characterize my own work. You know, that's for somebody else to do. And indeed, I'm only being very, very superficial in it, but we can talk about this. Pippa, your work seems somewhere between a writing practice, somewhere like maybe vaguely like Laura, but you seem to also bringing a lot of, you seem to be a sort of a science nut as well, and bringing a lot of, you know, a lot of other references that nobody else has brought here. So each of us is quite distinct in different ways. And I thought actually it would be really interesting to talk about that, and even maybe talk about, if anything should come out of this too. I mean, Johnny, maybe you do these once a week, I don't know, and this is just dime a dozen, but to me it's kind of special, and I just wonder if there's, you know, more after this, something.
Yeah, I mean, once a week would be exhausting. No, it's been great. I mean, we have actually, because of the kind of situation we're in, you know, the pandemic, it's been relatively easy to organise because it's all online. You know, if this had normally been something we'd have to pay for hotels and flights and get everybody here, that would have been difficult. This was much easier. But anyway, back to so back to Hayley's question: who wants to? Because that was a great summary by Lawrence. Laura.
I'd like to come back to Lawrence and then to Hayley's question, if that's okay. Lawrence, as some of you know, I've met Lawrence before, and one of the things I'm struck by your work, Lawrence, and I'm glad you went last in the presentations, is you always make me read things differently. Like there is always a moment of, I haven't been reading this. That could be read in a different way. It's not that I haven't been reading it correctly, but there is a different way of reading the London Underground map, for example, or space, or perspective, or the city, or the vanishing point. And one of the things I wondered, because we've all engaged with reading here for Beyond the Pleasure Principle, I don't know about you, but I reread it one more time to prepare for this. And there is something interesting in all our readings of the material, including the uncanny, which I think it was perfect to start with, because it was the text the year before, the text that set up Beyond the Pleasure Principle, such an essential text to read Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Otherwise, you don't know where you are, I think. So I think there is something around reading there that we could perhaps explore a little bit further. So where does this put us with Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 2020? Well, isn't it interesting to be in the year that is 2020 reading about the death drive with coronavirus? To me, it was very interesting to reread it in that context. And actually, I kept nodding at Freud and thinking, you're still right, Freud. You are still right. No matter how much, you know, academia thinks, oh, this is old hat, you know. There was something about the elegant expression of something unutterable. And I found myself thinking about how 2020 has literally and metaphorically taken us in the trajectory towards the death drive, whether it's through excess jouissance of certain pleasures in our own home when we don't have to go out, or considering our own ideas of destruction of the planet and the species, or our own confrontation of our own mortality. And this idea of the never alive, as you said, Johnny, which I think is a very beautiful idea, or the dead within us made more present than it had been, made me read Beyond the Pleasure Principle in a different way. And I would like to reread it a third time once we're over this. And I've thought about for me, the experience of reading was really, really strong this time. It felt it was a forgotten text to read at this time. And perhaps I should go to the third text about the drives that Lawrence was talking about, civilization and its discontents, to see what reveals about the current situation, actually.
I just, well, it's interesting. I read Civilization quite intensely a couple of years ago and virtually ignored Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And so it was, I read it a couple of times in preparation for today, and it was interesting to come to sort of read backwards from Civilization to Beyond to Instincts and Their Vicissitudes. I wanted to say, to me, what the relevance of Beyond and also of Civilization and its discontents for today, or one of the relevances is that, you know, we're fucking up our world in really bad ways really quickly all the time. You know, we've got kind of environmental crises about public life and politics. Personally, I think the environmental crisis is worse, but you know, it's probably hard to distinguish them, because if we you know if we don't have a public realm where we can sensibly make decisions, how are we ever going to solve the climate crisis? You know, but the point I want to make is that these papers, maybe Freud's thought in general, offers us the opportunity to not regard the ways that we're, I won't repeat the word, the ways that we're messing up the world. It offers us the opportunity to not regard the ways we're messing up the world as bad practice, but rather as pathology. And they have two totally different responses. With bad practice, what you do is you get a bunch of managers in to start regulating things, right? With pathology, what you do is you get a bunch of analysts in of whatever sort to start analyzing and alleviating problems, okay? And, you know, I mean, I come from the field of architecture, which is, you know, virtually all of the discussion of architecture in the public realm goes through all the questions of, you know, how architecture is regulated, whether it's the RIBA Code of Practice, the, you know, the building regulations, the Highways Act. I mean, all of that apparatus, it's all about regulation. And it's obviously not regulating us to a better world. So we need other approaches. And what, you know, psychoanalytic thinking offers, particularly papers such as what we've just read, which is attempting to bring psychoanalysis to a kind of world level, okay, is the possibility of returning to these problems as pathologies and approaching them with analysis, okay? That's what I think is where this could go. It's not a specific thing, but it's a more general and strategic.
It's complicated but positive, and thanks very much for that. Isabel, Pippa, anything? Yeah, Isabel.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think what Lawrence is saying is really true. And in terms of the question of why read Beyond the Pleasure Principle, or what's the relevance of what we've all been talking about today, for my part, I mean, although today I was speaking particularly about films, more generally, obviously because I'm my book is about artificial intelligence and the psychoanalysis of artificial intelligence. And what do I mean by that? Well, I try to engage with this new challenge in a way that isn't usually done, which is that AI is usually approached via people in the hard sciences or entrepreneurs or people who want to make lots of money and have lots of very terrifying ideas about what artificial intelligence is. But lots of them are, not many of them, I should say, are particularly well qualified to really think about what artificial intelligence is conceptually, or how we should start thinking about it as human beings or as psychoanalytic and philosophical thinkers. And so one of the main ways that I think about artificial intelligence is via the concept of jouissance. And first of all, looking at how the idea of intelligence is a concept that is so taken for granted as this reified thing that we can just manipulate and instrumentalize for the progression of the human race, or globalization, space travel, etc., etc. And what happens with this kind of sleight of hand is that people think that they know, oh, well, artificial intelligence, I know what intelligence is, so artificial intelligence must be an artificial version of it. But they haven't actually understood what intelligence is in the first place, because intelligence is an extremely loaded concept which has a huge history and genealogy of development through various different disciplines of the way that we understand what intelligence means and the different capacities that human beings have in order to be intelligent. So just that, first of all, trying to understand how intelligence relates to thought and how intelligence relates to human thinking. And immediately then you get into the realms of psychoanalysis, because you're then in the realms of speech and writing and the body, and how all of these questions are intimately bound up with jouissance and the death drive. So the step from that to how that relates to artificial intelligence more broadly is quite long, but what I want to say, I'll try and say succinctly, is that there is nothing that is happening out there in this technological world that we don't know so much about, that we shouldn't be thinking about. We should be thinking about all of it. When I say we, I mean psychoanalysts, philosophers, theorists. We should have a part in talking about that. We should be the ones also at the table with Neuralink and with the Blue Brain Project and with the travels to Mars, because these things matter to humans, and we have to employ our conceptual tools to be able to have conversations about this, not just people like Nick Bostrom or Elon Musk or Ray Kurzweil. This is serious, and therefore we need to employ the tools that have been put to so great use over the years for so many other different disciplines to other things as well, like as Pippa does in the scientific realm. There are so many ways that we can put our voices to the fore. But yeah, so beyond the pleasure principle, the death drive, these are things that all are relating to this different world that we're now entering into with space travel, with artificial intelligences, with biotechnologies, and there is lots and lots and lots to be done and lots to be thought about. So that would be my short answer.
So I've just got a couple short thoughts, and it really follows on really nicely from what Isabel was saying. One of the thoughts I had is that I live in Germany, a country that is suffused with anxiety about its past and in a constant sort of national debate about how not to repeat that past. And you see that debate everywhere. You go in Germany, every aspect of society is still sort of engaged with how to avoid the death drive, essentially. sort of taking over again. And so I think it's really interesting to see how that debate has arisen in Germany. It hasn't been a straightforward history. It's if you look at the past sort of 70 years or so in this country, which was once sort of two countries, there's only been one country for 30 years. And I think we can learn a lot perhaps from a way that sort of self-questioning, that kind of analysis is being carried out on a sort of social public level. And we can use that to do what Isabel rightly says, really query what is happening in sort of technological advances, but perhaps particularly around outer space exploration, which is only ever discussed in terms of science sort of and technological advances, like how to build big rockets, how to solve technical problems, but we haven't really seen any kind of engagement, apart from perhaps in science fiction, about the psychological drivers of what some people are doing in order to explore outer space. And I think that's absolutely critical, really, for the future of humanity. We're being told this is a possible solution. If we go off and colonize Mars, this is a solution to our environmental problems here on Earth. But there's no proper discussion of what that actually means on any level at all, in terms of what problems we're leaving behind and who gets involved, and who has the power and who is controlling these discussions. And I think this type of sort of discussion here could be absolutely crucial to it. So that wasn't very sort of yeah, I don't want to go on for too long, because we can say an awful lot more about that, but I just think those discussions around technologies are just too sort of limited at the moment, and I think different groups of people need to get involved in that type of decision making.
I just want to put in this mention is that we're actually, myself and Ingmar Hinz are starting a project on the psychoanalysis of space travel. So in the future, the near future, I think we'll be putting out a call for papers for people to put forward ideas as well. So hopefully this is something that people might want to be putting their ideas to.
Lovely, great. So thanks very much, everybody. I mean, I think that's a great place to finish. Actually, we could go on, as Pippa said, a long time. There's lots of subjects to science fiction we haven't done enough of at all. You know, there are loads of topics that we could just go on with. You know, so and what's amazing, we start with this this work, which is really, what is it about? This work about the topographical and the strategic and in the understanding of mental processes, and what we see is that in fact we end up with something which gives us the possibility to be variegated in approach, multiform in presentation, endless in possible understandings, as we've seen today, and in possible future developments, as we've just heard from Isabel. So that was really wonderful. I would like to, I think we'll probably just call it to a close there, Hayley, and I would like to thank all our guests, Pippa Goldschmidt, Laura Gonzalez, Isabel Miller, and Lawrence Holm. This was absolutely fantastic talks. It was a wonderful afternoon. I'd also like to thank our guest artist for the whole Pleasuring Freud experience. She's actually on a flight to New Zealand even as we speak. So Elke Finkenauer, wonderful artworks to front the website. I'd like to thank everyone at the Drouth. Everyone at Drouth who put in work, especially my colleague and co-organiser Hayley, and of course my daughter Peggy Nan Roger, who was working away in the background there. So I'd like to thank everyone at Glasgow School of Art, especially Claire Biddles and Michael Collins. And yeah, that was a wonderful afternoon. I don't know if you've got anyone to add to that, Hayley, or? No,
I just think it's absolutely wonderful that we ended up today thinking about possibilities for dealing with the reality of debates that in Freud's day were, considered only as ideas, and what we would be doing by reinserting philosophy, critical thought, the humanities into conversations about technological futures is not creating something new, but reclaiming that space where thought should always have been. So thank you everyone for coming along. It's been a really great Saturday.
It really has.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Been
Thanks.
brilliant.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Cheers then.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye, Lawrence. Don't see you, so maybe you say something, your picture will come up. Bye. No. Okay. Bye, guys. Thanks so much. Oh, there's Lawrence there. Bye, Lawrence. Thanks very much.
And thank you. This was really fabulous.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Great. Well, we'll be in touch and we'll see what we can do. Maybe we could do something in the future. I mean, it would be a shame just to finish it all there, but so great. Wonderful. Thanks, everybody. And bye for now.